Wow, who wants to come after Michael and Tamron and Maxwell? Tough act to follow. But at least Maxwell made me feel good about having reading glasses on, so I'm gonna put these on for the teleprompter. But before you start it rolling, I just wanna say there's so many amazing faces in the audience tonight who represent the excellence and greatness of who we are as a people, but none more so than Susan Taylor, who has brought us all here together tonight. So thank you, Susan. I love you. I salute you. And I'm so, so thankful to be a part of tonight. All right. So, in addition to loving Susan and Michael, my brother from Detroit, we also love National Cares mentoring. So my husband, Raymond McGuire, who just returned from Davos, that's why he's not up here with me now, but he is in the audience. I'd like to also thank him for being not only an extraordinary husband, but a leader and a mentor to so many in this room, an extraordinary father, and my fellow co-chair this evening. Do you mind standing, honey, please? Ray McGuire. We are so proud to serve as the Gala co-chairs because it presents a real opportunity to not just talk about the need for change, but to help to make it happen. We know that it's immoral to allow children's lives to be shredded by poverty in this nation. And few have done more to challenge the immorality and dream-crushing pain of impoverishment than our first honoree, the Reverend Dr. William J. Barber II has done. Hold the teleprompter, please. I know most of you in here have heard him speak, but I just have to say one thing. I had the opportunity of hearing him speak on Martin Luther King Day at the Fifth Avenue Baptist Church, or Presbyterian Church, and he is the truth. It was life-changing for us. He's the former president of the North Carolina NAACP state chapter. Dr. Barber is the co-chair of the New Poor People's Campaign, the national president of Repairers of the Breach, a visiting professor at Union Theological Seminary, and pastor of Greenleaf Christian Church in Goldsboro, North Carolina. As architect of Moral Mondays, civil protests in North Carolina state capitol, which began with 17 people and grew to be 100,000 strong, Dr. Barber led a movement that shifted the consciousness of what the state did and what many said could not be done in the South. It built an intergenerational coalition of Black, white, brown, Asian, Native American, gay and straight, Jewish, Christian, Muslim people who, standing together, won the case against voter suppression, and then the case against redistricting. Today, for the first time in history, there are 2 African American justices in the state Supreme Court of North Carolina. The Fusion Coalition has become a model for how we can work together, dismantling false barriers all across the country. Dr. Barber's commitment and genius have touched and inspired Ray and I during these challenging and divisive times. Not divisiveness in our community, but divisive times elsewhere. Reverend Dr. Barber's steadfast leadership has given us hope, and he has been the embodiment of what Jesus tells us in Matthew 25. Truly, I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. Let us take a moment to look at this video.
My parents made decisions that impacted me early in my life. For a long time, however, I didn't understand why I cried all the time. I'm a crybaby. I have sometimes I'm almost embarrassed by it. And I talked to an elderly lady one time and her husband, and she said, you have to remember that your mother carried you in a year of great tears. George Wallace was railing about segregation. People were blowing up churches. Medgar Evers was shot. You were born in a season of tears, but you were born to cry because you care. I want to be ever vigilant and be a part of a community that is ever vigilant against injustice.
Yes, these are troubling times, but by faith, we don't give up to evil. Faith stands up. Faith speaks truth to power. I wish I had a witness here.
In 1993, all of a sudden, one morning, I woke up and I could not walk. And for 12 years, I battled a horrific arthritic condition. I was going to quit pastoring, and the members of my church said, no, we're going to do this together. And after 12 years, I recovered the ability to walk again. I was called one day by some people who came to the church and said, you keep talking about what ought to be done. You're speaking all around the state. Why don't you become the state president of NAACP? I said, I don't want to do that. They said, well, either shut up or put up. I've been pastoring Greenleaf Christian Church since 1993. It's a 132-year-old congregation. It's a congregation that sits in a community that has high level of poverty. We took a compass, put the church at the center of the point, drew a 2-inch ring as a 2-mile radius, and said, what's in this community? What's going on? You are engaging in malpractice if you simply hide within the sanctuary. So we developed something called Rebuilding Broken Places, Community Development Corporation. We invested $1.2 million of our own money. We said, let's build the community. And that $1.2 million has turned into about $14 million of development within a 2-mile radius. I'm in the South, and the Moral Monday movement began in 2013 when an extremist group of legislators who claimed to be Republicans took over the North Carolina legislature and the governorship through voter suppression and through racialized redistricting. And then during the Holy Week of Holy Week, they passed a bill in the Senate, and the name of it was Senate Bill 666. And it was the worst form of voter suppression that we've seen since the 19th century. We decided that week that we needed to stand up and expose what they were doing. If they were going to crucify the poor and crucify the sick and crucify the LGBT community and immigrants and crucify voting rights, that every crucifixion demanded a witness. On April 29th of 2013, we decided to go to the next level and to engage in agenda-based civil disobedience. We built a long-term game, and we built a strategy. And after 4 years, we were able to have significant victories. And so the Moral Monday movement is simply this. It's a deeply moral, deeply constitutional, anti-racist, anti-poverty, pro-justice, pro-labor fusion coalition. And we did it in the South, where people often say you can't get black and white and brown and red and young and old and gay and straight and Muslim and Christian and Jew to come together. 50 years ago, Dr. King, the Jewish Federation, welfare workers came together and said, we need a poor people's campaign that addresses the issues of poverty, racism, and militarism. Today, 50 years later, systemic racism is real. Systemic poverty is real. There are more than 100 million poor and working poor people in the richest nation in the world. There are 14 million poor children in this nation. Our goal is to organize 1,000 people per state, 2,500 people in the District of Columbia, with the first focus being on child poverty. In the Poor People's Campaign, we're gonna say how we can do these things. We can have living wages. We can guarantee people a certain income if they're poor. We can have universal health care. We could have automatic registration to vote at 18. If you can be sent to war automatically at 18, you ought to be automatically registered to vote at 18. And we know right now, if we just took 3 to 4% of the federal budget and used it for programs that work, we could end child poverty today. It is not the resources, it is the will. The first sign of progress is when you commit to stand against injustice with the power of love and truth until, not for a political season, not for one election. You make the commitment to stand until. I think the second way we have to understand progress is we have to look back in history and realize that justice has never ultimately lost. It's been bruised, beat up, crucified, and broken, but it's never lost. I hear people say, we've never seen this before. You've never seen this before. Do you know American history? You have progress and then you have a reaction. Now, ultimately, progress is when everybody has a living wage. We have universal health care. When we no longer fund the war economy more than we do the economy of social uplift. We must recapture our moral imagination and our discontent with the way things are. If Harriet Tubman could get 500 people out of slavery, she didn't have Google, she didn't have Twitter, she didn't have a cell phone, all she had was moss on the north side of a tree and a made-up, determined mind that she wasn't gonna be a slave. If she could fight then we have no excuse to mourn now. We only have to decide it's our time.
To the U.S. Capitol and every state capital until the cries of the poor are heard. We must go down.
Look back. This is the truth of who we are. The villages and communities of our African forebears were bound by the belief that family and the...
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the former executive director of the National Newspaper Publishers Association and the youngest man who ever served as president and CEO of the NAACP, Ben Jealous.
Well, good evening. It is a joy to be here with you tonight to celebrate one of the great soldiers and leaders in our ongoing civil rights movement. 200 years ago this year, a man was born in Maryland named Frederick Douglass, who would go on to tell us just after the Civil War that the destiny of our nation was to be, quote, the most perfect example of the unity and dignity of the human family that the world has ever known. And for more than a century and a half, the American civil rights movement has pushed towards that goal, often being pushed back, but always pushing forward further. More than a decade ago, a young pastor rose up in North Carolina, calling together hundreds of thousands of people to the state capitol, HK on J, talking of a fusion politic that had not been talked about in that state since the Wilmington Massacre. A politic that said that we could all come together across every line that is supposed to divide us, to push us towards that destiny that Frederick Douglass talked about. Then the Tea Party rose up, and what was about one state became about many states as he expanded it into the Moral Monday movement. And now Donald Trump is in office. And this pastor, now a little less young, from North Carolina, is seeking to call all of us to pick up the baton that Dr. King left us and finally win the war to end poverty in the world's wealthiest nation. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming to this stage our North Star Award winner, Reverend Dr. William Barber II.
We certainly give honor to God tonight for God's grace and God's mercy, and to my church family, to my family, to all of the people in the Forward Together Moral Movement and the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, are the real ones that I accept this award on their behalf. So a few weeks ago, I got a call from Susan Taylor, and I fell out. I just was slain in the spirit. Then she told me what she wanted me to do, where she wanted me to be, told me, did not ask me, told me. Of course, in a very sweet way, but still she told me. And then she said that Cicely Tyson would be there, and I fell out again. So I've been doing a lot of falling. But tonight I want to thank all of the honorary co-hosts, my brother Michael Dyson and sister Tamron Hall and Crystal McCarthy and Raymond McGuire, to the Root, BET, Essence, to my good friend and soon-to-be Governor Ben Jealous. Amen. There is a scripture that Dr. King and others carried with them, Freddie, and I carry it with me in these days. It says in the 11th division of Hebrews, we are not of those who shrink back unto destruction, but we are those who persevere unto the salvation of our souls, because faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. In his last sermon in Memphis, it was a tough time. He was under death threat. Dr. King, George Wallace was running, Richard Nixon was running, LBJ had said he wasn't going to run, the war in Vietnam was going on, 150 newspapers had written against Dr. King after he gave his speech here in New York City at Riverside. Most of the civil rights organizations, Charles, even in the NAACP, had passed resolutions against him. The union movement had left him. Most of the churches had left him. There was dissension in the ranks. We remember when he said, I went to the mountaintop and I looked over, but before he said that, Dr. King said, let me say as I move to my conclusion that we've got to give ourselves to this struggle till the end. And then he said 11 words, nothing would be more tragic than for us to stop at this point. My brothers and sisters, we come from a people that have come from worse than what we see now. And nothing would be more tragic than for us to turn back now. Don't you ever let it come out of your mouth that we've never seen anything this bad, that we've never seen racism in the White House. Don't you even dare let your children hear you utter that, because we came through 250 years of slavery and 100 years of legalized Jim Crow. Nothing would be more tragic than for us to turn back now. Right now, we have a moral malady. What we see in the White House and in the Congress is not one person. Those are symptoms of a deeper moral malady, the loss of a moral imagination. And I can give you 3 stats. When 52 years after Selma and the Voting Rights Act, we have 23 states since 2010 that have passed voter suppression laws and redistricting laws. Right now, we're going backwards rather than forward. The Voting Rights Act has been gutted. 52 years later, we have less voting rights than we had August 6, 1965. That is a moral malady. When the fact of the matter is that when it comes to poverty, there are over 140 million people, poor and working poor, in this country. The majority of them are white, not black. The majority of them are women and children. When we see that in the times in which we live, and when we know that we just passed a tax so-called reform, which is really welfare to the wealthy, bill that is extracting more money on the backs of poor folk than was extracted during slavery. $3 trillion is more than was extracted from the sale of slaves. And when people do that gloatingly, we don't just have a Democrat party problem or a Republican party, we have a moral problem. when we are spending 53 cents of every discretionary dollar on war in the 21st century, we have a moral problem. But my friends, we've always had to have people that would stand up and reshape the moral narrative. And lastly, I would say to you, so I read this little book called the Bible. And in Ezekiel 22, there's a word you ought to read because it explains this moment right now. It goes like this. It says, in Ezekiel 22, it says, your politicians have become like wolves, devouring the lives of the children, the women, the orphans, and the strangers. But then there's something worse going on. Your preachers are covering up for the politicians. And then God says to Ezekiel, I looked for somebody that would stand in the gap and could not find anybody. Go over 15 chapters, and then God said, go down to the valley. Go down there. There's some bones down there. There's some poor bones down there. There's some gay bones down there. There's some bones without living wages down there. There's some bones without health care down there. There's some white bones down there. There's some black bones down there. There's some brown bones. There's some Latino bones. There's some immigrant bones down there. Just go to the valley, because there's a whole valley of bones that have been devoured by the wolves. Now, they don't look like much, but just remember, Ezekiel, bones still have ears. Bones can still hear. And if you will sound the right voice, if you will preach the right sermon, there's an army that can rise from the bones. And so on Mother's Day, in 25 states and the District of Columbia, and in Ryan's office and McConnell's office, the bones are going to rise one more time. We've been going all over the country organizing with poor folk and with clergy, and we're going to have 40 days of direct action and civil disobedience around a moral agenda called the Souls of Poor Folk. 40 days to launch a movement, not end a movement, of voter mobilization. And we're going not in the places they tell us we can protest, Ben. They say you can stay over there and protest. No, we're going in Ryan's office in the Capitol. We're going in McConnell's office in the Capitol. We're going in state capitals for 6 straight weeks with the poor and the broken and moral leaders to reset the moral narrative. We had 26 debates in this country, both Democrat and Republican, and not a word about poverty, not a word about systemic racism. That's the problem. If the narrative is wrong, the agenda is going to always be wrong. And I'm telling you, I've been from El Paso, walking in the middle of the Rio Grande to welfare workers in Detroit, to poor people in Kentucky and West Virginia, to Compton, and I'm telling you, there's an army rising. There's an army of poor people rising. There's an army of broken people rising. You need to know that the rejected are going to lead the revival, because the Bible said that the stones that the builders rejected shall lead the revival. Do you know what today is? I'm going to my seat, but do you know what today is? Do you know what today is? Today is the anniversary of George White. George White was the last black congressperson put out of the Congress at the end of Reconstruction. He gave a speech, Charles, before he left. He said, I'm exiting today, but my people, like the phoenix from the fire, shall rise again. I'm telling you, there's a rising happening. I'm telling you, there's an army rising. And when this army gets together, black and white and brown, when this army gets together, gay and straight and transgender, when this army gets together, Muslim and Christian and Hindu and Jewish, when this army gets together, Southern and Northern, it's going to break every chain. I'm sorry, but I need to holler one time. It's going to break every chain.